All right, hello, welcome to the Modern Thought Room. My name is Jethro. This episode, let me get right. This episode is going to be a continuation on the conversation about conversation and how I believe conversation is one of those skills that when we focus on it and improve it, we then improve our ability to show up as intended. Right. So conversation is an interactive, informal exchange of thoughts, ideas, or feelings between two or more people. Right. In this episode, we're going to dive into the exchange aspect. All right. We're going to dive into the exchange aspect. So that part comes up where it's a conversation, right, is an interactive, informal exchange of thoughts, ideas, or feelings between two or more people. And the main premise again is that when we improve and when we actually take the time out to improve how we show up in conversation, it ultimately helps us show up as intended, right? So that means the potential of who we think we can be now gets realized, and not only once it gets realized, it then gets extended, right? Or then it gets expanded, right? So conversation as exchange is the focus for this conversation. The first part is the getting, right? The first part is the getting. So this part is sometimes all of these are going to sort of work in the same way where depending on who you are and how you kind of enter conversation, it's going to depend on what angle most applies to your situation, right? So the getting part, and that sometimes is the motivation behind conversation for many folks is to get some sort of information, right? To get some type of intel, some type of insight, something that they didn't know previously, something that can help them make a decision, something they're looking for what they're going to get out of the conversation. And that is a particular reason why folks don't like people that talk too much, have too many details, trying to explain a bunch of stuff, because a core setting in how they entered the conversation was, what am I going to get from this? And the more words you're using, it's taking up my getting, right? Now, not saying again right or wrong, situational context kind of defines, you know, what's best, but that is a big part of an exchange, right? Is an exchange is the person thinking about the getting has to also kind of see that value in what I am getting. And that's something for real that I'm, making sure that I'm working on is that all right, if I'm in a conversation with somebody and I pick up on what their expectations are, or I come in knowing what their expectations are, then it makes it easier for me to understand what they want to get out of the conversation. And there's no issue with helping people get what they need to get out of the conversation, right? Because that is part of the exchange, right? You're getting, they're getting, and that's an exchange, right? When conversations are one sided and the other person isn't getting anything on the other end, that's when you run into problems, right? So, in order to not only just get yourself, but to maintain the kind of harmony that exists in a conversation or should exist, is you have to give, right? So, you have to say, this is the information I'm coming after. This is what would be of benefit for them, right? And you're balancing the scales based on what the exchange of information is about, right? And it's a principle thing. It's not necessarily a every conversation type of thing. It's the heart of it is exchanges where both parties win. Those are the foundations, right? Of or that is the foundation of sort of good business or good relationships, is when there's a mutual win-win kind of situation out of a circumstance, right? And in this case, we're talking about conversation. So when you're going into the person is also leaving feeling like they like came up positive or came up on top also, right? So it's not like a one-sided thing where only one person is getting and the other person is leaving empty-handed. Now again, I'm using these as words to kind of break down the principled approach about it, but it's not like that's not how the everyday convo is going to quote unquote flow, but it's the mindset that needs to be included in order to, right, keep improving, keep getting better, and keep making it so that the exchange aspect of a conversation is respected. And where that will show up is you will start to, it'll be quicker, it'll be easier and quicker for you to identify the differences in people. And it'll be a lot easier to kind of spot out kind of people that are a bit, I'm hesitating on the word selfish, but are a little bit nearsighted and they don't necessarily see how yet to add value to you. When you run into people that you kind of like, your ears will perk up when you hear, I see what this person is trying to do. This person's trying to make sure that after we've had that, before we end this conversation, that I'm also getting, like, they're giving me, I came in here, the conversation, maybe I was supposed to give them something, but I sense that in how they are structuring, their responses, what they're sharing, they are out to also make sure that I'm getting something from it as well, right? And that's a very important thing that makes the difference when people are building relationships, particularly professional relationships, where sometimes people might not know the difference. I know, like, sometimes people have frustrations with networking and things like that, when a lot of times it boils down to maybe you're talking to the wrong person and there's not a place for you guys to have valuable exchange. And so maybe for that one person, they don't see it as a value, and that kind of closes that door. When you find the people that you are at a place to properly network with, there will be exchange. There will be something that not only you're getting, but then you're also able to give them, and that's going to help them in whatever they're traversing at the time. So the giving and the getting part, right? Not every conversation will break down systematically where it's like, hey, I'm coming for you for this piece of information. Can you give me this piece of information? I'll give you. Not everyone will flow like that. But for people that are attuned to recognizing when someone else wants to offer them a benefit as well, that will be when it comes to the test, if you actually conversate with principle, right? If you're hogging the line, like you're on the phone, if you have a good friend and all the time you're the only one that is, hogging the mic and you're not passing the mic, right? Because that's in the social context a little bit different what the need there is, right? The need to be heard, the need to be seen. If you do not platform that other person in that conversation to allow them to be seen, allow them to be heard, what you'll be doing is then taking away from that exchange aspect um, of that relationship in the conversation, and ultimately you actually be hurting the relationship. All right. Again, somebody shares very confidential information with you. Yes, that's good, but if they're coming to you all the time with confidential information and you have nothing of value to also share with them, that's a slippery slope type of situation for the relationship, right? The return, right? The return, what is that as an outcome of this exchange? What's the value that that person feels that they've gotten from that exchange? Right now, again, I always have to preface this by saying not every conversation will be as tactical, but this is a principle that helps you understand when you do go into conversation, what type of impact can I have in this conversation with this person so that they left with some sort of benefit. Again, this um, this isn't something necessary that'll be executed every time, but when you are in situations where you need to make an impression on someone, this is when you're having a principled approach to how you talk to folks does make a difference, right? And whether it's like folks that work in sales definitely play on dynamics of how conversation flow and when and where to maybe have insert the pitch or the sell or try to close or talk about a feature. Like, they have a knowledge of how, okay, this is how I talk to people that actually have um, purchased what I'm trying to sell. This is how I've talked to people that I think, you know if I had been a little bit, lean this way or that way at this point in the conversation. It kind of made a difference. This is when in the conversation I realized this is not going anywhere. So again, these are actual skills that people in different professions use day in and day out. So there's a principled aspect to it. So you want to just make sure that when you're thinking about it, what's the return, that the impact that you're having as part of, as being somebody that's participating in the conversation, that the person on the other end is also like, I benefited from having a conversation with that person. Oh, that was very thoughtful. That was a great perspective. That was funny. That was interesting. I didn't think about it like that. I didn't see it like that. That helps me better understand this, right? And an ability to do and make those kind of differences, it's when you're very perceptive, right? And so there's a lot of dynamics involved in making an impact in conversation. That again, as I said, like previously, I'm going to say now, is you're building up a lot of other skills as you are fine tuning how you show up in conversation, with the sole purpose, right, of getting to the place where you are more consistent at showing up as intended. And when the more often you show up as intended, the more you make that move towards actually reaching your potential and what you see that you can do, what you believe you can do. And then in no time, you'll be taking what you knew you could do and expanding that, and expanding your potential, what you could contribute. Right. So think about the getting, the giving, the return, the influence. This is a big part about exchange, is influence, right? Power dynamics are so important. And if you're the person with more power in that heading into that conversation, that's something you should just wield um, with a real humble heart. It's really gross watching somebody abuse their power and influence in a conversation with someone. It's kind of disgusting stuff to look at and hear. Um, it's no bueno. It's no bueno. So if you're going into a situation and you understand the leverage that you have because of the power dynamics, you then should take on that responsibility as a sort of de facto leader in that conversation to balance the scales a little bit so that you can get more out of the other participants, right? Getting more out of the other participants then improves the collective return of that conversation, right? So it's not that you're like, lowering yourself for no reason. What you're doing is you're showing your tact or your guile as a leader to then get more out of that person that may be stifled by the gulf or chasm created by the power dynamics going into the conversation, right? So if somebody doesn't, if a person doesn't, feel confident enough to share what they need to share, it could be disastrous. And this is very common in group settings, right? Group settings, this is, I think, notorious, um, with, especially when it comes to ideas and perspectives and things like that, where there's a lot of good perspectives and ideas that get left on the table, because the the sort of leaders or the powers that be of that session, of that group, they are monopolizing perspective. That's a big thing to say, monopolizing perspective. It's something that I try to make sure I do not do in moments where I know that, okay, I have influence in this moment. Um, it's something that I like try to slow down, because it's, when you're in that case, when you're the person that is on the outside of that monopolized perspective, you do feel stifled. And the thing about ideas, perspectives, and things like that, it's not the same thing as when, I'm gonna say this. It's not the same thing as when someone is doing something tangibly different, right? When somebody's doing something tangibly different, right? So that's a process that you're doing different. There's a task that needs to be done. They're going about it a completely different way, right? That can create issues, right? And so for a group, yes, we get it that we need to homogenize the processes so that, you know, we can be very efficient. Now, in conversation, what happens though, and this is like a real subtle nuance, and this I think is a way that a lot of leaders actually hurt their influence and stifle their teammates through this, right? Is me doing something differently that can potentially make things go slower is a different problem than me having a conversation with you about what I think about something. Two, they're they often they can kind of like clash sometimes and can seem to be one and the same, but they're actually two different things, right? And so the care that needs to be accompanied with just a conversation of perspective and ideas is different than the functioning of sort of what would be kind of related to those ideas and things like that. Because um, when you shut down people's ideas, or perspectives, or in this case, we're talking about conversation, their ability to communicate these things, you're ultimately but you can potentially stunt their growth. I'll say it like that. You can potentially stunt their growth. Right. So influence, power dynamics, very important. Again, the getting, the giving, the return, the influence, and then the value assessment. Right. The value assessment. The value assessment is probably a summative thing that happens at the end, right? But influence is what happens next in a very chicken or the egg kind of way. How? Well, you had a conversation with somebody. You're like, man, that was a waste of my time. Next day, you run into them. How are you going into that? What's your mindset going into that next conversation? If you say, okay, all right, I'll give them another chance, let's see how this conversation goes, cool. But if you're like, no, I'm going to shut this down before it gets started, now you've already curtailed a lot. And depending on, I don't know the context of whatever that situation is for you, depending on the truth of that decision, it could be a very good thing or it could be a bad thing, right? It could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing, right? So if you're, leader, if you are managing a group, if you're coaching a team, and you have the different perspectives that are coming, left and right of you, and you got to make the difference, you have to kind of find a way to keep them on side, and conversation is arguably one of the easiest ways to keep them on side without having to drastically impact processes of how you do things. Entertaining a conversation with somebody that has a perspective, oftentimes it's the perspective that they want to get. They just want to release the perspective. They want to let somebody else hear it and also chime in on it. They don't necessarily mean that we have to stop what we're doing to run by that thought or idea. And that's a slight difference, right? That when you sometimes don't understand what the purpose of conversation is, you can unnecessarily create distance with people for no reason, like for no reason, right? And so, again, a lot of times, no matter anytime somebody's having a conversation with you, they a part of them, especially if they're frequently having conversation or they have conversation with you more than one. If at some point you're not making an effort to acknowledge them, make them feel seen, make them feel heard to any degree, you're creating a rift for ultimately no reason. Why? Because conversations, we go back and read the definition, right? Informal exchange of thoughts, ideas, or feelings, right? These, you're not signing legislation. You're not building prototypes. You're not approving big budgets, right? You're having an informal exchange, right? And so, yes, again, there might be context where maybe the conversation is pretty important, in the sense that you're one step away from it becoming a formal conversation and there being a decision being made. Yes, there is that. But while it's still informal and while it's still not a definitive, it doesn't arrive at a definitive end, there is room for you there to build that relationship and provide value. And the value that you're providing, it's a sort of um, psychological, emotional, um, relational value, but it can also be, and probably look at that in different instance. It could also be like an actual material value, or in terms of like the information that's shared, right? So backing up, conversation as an exchange, it's a very important concept to remember. It's a principle. It's not a one to 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 one type of thing for you to go and rush and implement. But when you are in conversation in general, right, these are things that you need to balance out. You need to balance out the getting, the giving, the return, the influence, and then the complete value assessment, and ultimately how you kind of, package that experience, right? And this is a very kind of sort of in the weeds type of look at aspects of a conversation, specifically with the mindset of it being an exchange, right? Why? Because as you are being intentional and doing things on purpose, how you think about things will fundamentally change. And and when things start to change about when you start changing how you think about things, that accelerates transformation. The goal of this accelerating your transformation is so that you can show up as intended more consistently. The more you show up as you intend consistently, the bigger impact you have, and the more you now see for yourself, and the greater capacity you ultimately can achieve, right? So, as always, thank you for your time. Appreciate you guys. Catch you next episode. Bye bye.